In 1974, a woman named Carol Ann Briggs in Terre Haute, Indiana, pulled a recipe card from a tin box above her refrigerator. On it, in her mother's handwriting, was a recipe for cinnamon sugar pecans. 3 ingredients. A bag of pecans cost 89 cents. A 5-pound bag of sugar cost 69 cents. She made them every Saturday afternoon while her kids watched cartoons in the next room, and the whole house smelled like Christmas in July. That recipe card is still in the box. Nobody has pulled it out in 40 years. Number 47 on this list used one ingredient from a box of cereal that every kitchen in America had. Number 19 took 10 minutes and no oven at all. And number 1 was so easy that children made it themselves, and yet somehow no snack company has ever been able to copy it. These were not store-bought snacks. They were not wrapped in plastic. They came from your mother's kitchen, your grandmother's recipe box, and a time when homemade meant something. Hit that subscribe button. Here are 60 easy homemade snacks from the 1970s that no one makes anymore.
Ice cube chocolates, known for their smooth texture and unique cooling sensation, have been a luxurious treat since the 1930s. Their small, cube-like shape made them perfect for savoring slowly, enhancing the cooling effect. Their innovative formula allows them to melt quickly, providing an instant cool effect that distinguishes them from other chocolates. This unique melting property, combined with their rich flavor, has made ice cube chocolates a sought-after delicacy for those who appreciate the finer things in life. The elegance and innovation of ice cube chocolates continue to make them a cherished treat, evoking memories of indulgent moments and the timeless appeal of chocolate.
At every Thanksgiving spread, every Christmas Eve buffet, every funeral repast in the 70s, a relish tray held its place at the edge of the table, and stuffed celery was always on it. The filling was softened cream cheese beaten smooth, folded with chopped pimento-stuffed green olives and a little of the olive brine for sharpness. You spooned it into the curve of each stalk, then lined them up between carrot sticks and radish roses. The crunch of the celery against the tang of the olives, cold, crisp, and gone before the turkey was carved. Making the relish tray was the job of whoever arrived first, and the women who did it took quiet pride in how neatly the celery was cut, how evenly the filling sat. It was never the star of the table, but its absence was always noticed. The relish tray itself has all but vanished now, and the stuffed celery went with it. Canned Vienna sausages eaten cold from the can were the after-school snack no child would admit to liking if anyone from school was watching, which is exactly why they tasted so good alone in the kitchen on a Thursday. You pried the pull tab, heard the hiss of brine, and ate them straight from the can with a fork or your fingers, standing over the sink. They came from Armour Star or Libby's, packed 6 to a can in pale salt solution. They carried a distant connection to the Vienna sausage tradition that German and Austrian immigrants had brought to American cities in the mid-1800s, though what came out of the Armour can in 1983 bore little resemblance to what a Viennese butcher produced in 1850. The can was the point. The eating over the sink was the point. The not telling anyone was the point. Nobody makes a snack of them now. Pawpaws grew in the low-shaded hollows near creeks, and you had to know where to find them. The trees gave no obvious signal, and the fruit did not survive being carried. The native Appalachian fruit ripened in late August into something that tasted like banana crossed with mango, a custard yellow flesh loose around large dark seeds. You ate it under the tree, splitting it with your thumbs, scooping out the flesh with your fingers, because the fruit bruised black and soft within a day of picking. This is why no one outside the mountains had tasted one fresh. Pawpaws are the largest fruit native to North America, eaten by Native Americans for thousands of years. Lewis and Clark relied on them for food in 1806. Appalachian families guarded their groves with silence and quiet misdirection. Your grandfather knew where 3 groves were. He showed your father one. He showed you the same one. The other 2 locations went with him when he went. Number 21. Buttermilk candy. Not many people have heard of buttermilk candy outside the rural South, but in the farm communities of central Georgia and the flatlands of West Tennessee, it was on the Christmas plate every single year. It starts like fudge, sugar, butter, and heat, but the buttermilk changes everything. The acid reacts with baking soda and creates a candy that is lightly tan, almost caramel-colored, with a faint sourness underneath the sweetness. It tastes like nothing else. Grandmothers in those communities described it as what fudge would taste like if fudge had a little more character. A cup of buttermilk cost almost nothing. A woman who kept a milk cow had buttermilk every day for free. This was the candy she made when she wanted something that tasted like home. Your grandmother knew what she was doing when she made it. The Western egg sandwich lived in the middle ground between breakfast and lunch that the 1970s always seemed full of. Scrambled eggs cooked with diced ham, green bell pepper, and white onion, just set enough to hold together, spooned onto thick white bread or a Kaiser roll while still warm. The story involves railroad workers heading west through Denver, the ham and eggs as portable protein, the peppers as whatever grew nearby, and whether accurate or not, it became a short-order counterstaple through the post-war decades, appearing on coffee shop menus from Ohio to Oregon without explanation. Your grandmother made it on Saturday mornings when the eggs needed to be used. She never called it a Denver sandwich. She called it eggs with the leftover ham. You haven't made it since she stopped cooking. Coconut haystacks were one of the simplest Christmas candies ever created, but they tasted like 100 tiny holiday miracles stacked together. Made from shredded coconut mixed with warm sugar syrup, they were the candy equivalent of childhood scribbles, messy, uneven, and absolutely perfect. Mothers loved how easy they were to prepare when time and ingredients were limited, and children loved how they looked like little snowy mounds waiting to be snatched from the tray. You just heated the syrup, stirred in the coconut until every strand glistened, and dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper to set. No tricks, no thermometers, no weather conditions required. Despite their simplicity, haystacks carried the same excitement as more complicated candies because they tasted like pure sweetness and holiday energy. They were popular across the country, especially in homes where budgets were tight and store-bought treats were luxuries. Over time, they faded from Christmas tables as more elaborate desserts took their place, but older generations still talk about them with the same affection as childhood toys and snowy mornings. Coconut haystacks captured the heart of homemade Christmas candy. Cheap, cheerful, and made with love instead of precision. Sukiyaki at the American dinner table was its own kind of theater. A shallow iron pan on a portable burner at the center, soy sauce and mirin and sugar already simmering, everyone reaching in with long chopsticks or forks to cook their own piece of thinly sliced beef, tofu, and shirataki noodles in the communal broth, then dipping each bite into a raw, beaten egg before eating. The dish came to American kitchens partly on the back of cultural curiosity sparked by Kyu Sakamoto's 1963 song Sukiyaki, the only Japanese-language recording to ever reach #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and American grocery stores began stocking home sukiyaki kits: the shallow iron pan, the portable burner, the sauce packets. The broth deepened with every addition during the meal, each diner's choices gradually flavoring the shared pot for everyone else. The way it worked at the table, genuinely communal cooking, nobody eating alone, the food built together, was unlike anything else in the Western dinner repertoire. The kits stopped appearing on shelves in the 1980s. The habit they briefly installed went with them. You measured nothing. A handful of peanuts, a handful of raisins, M&Ms poured in until the color looked right. Then you shook the bag and called it done. Gorp, good old raisins and peanuts, was the original trail mix. And through the 70s, it went everywhere families did. Into backpacks on scout trips, into station wagons on cross-country drives, into brown bags beside thermoses at Little League games. The combination of nuts, dried fruit, and chocolate as portable hiking food traces to at least the 1910s when outdoorsman Horace Kephart recommended a similar mix in his camping guide. Every family had a version: sunflower seeds, coconut flakes, butterscotch chips instead of chocolate. The only rule was you made it yourself and made enough to share. When trail mix appeared in pre-made bags at the gas station in the 80s, it stopped being something you assembled around the kitchen table. Nobody fought over the last handful of a gas station bag the way they fought over their mother's gorp.
Chunky chocolate bars, with their distinctive silver foil wrapping and unique trapezoid shape, have been a favorite since the 1930s. Their dense composition provided a satisfyingly rich bite that was both indulgent and filling. The combination of milk chocolate, raisins, and nuts in a thick, chunky size offered a rich and satisfying snacking experience. Chunky's memorable name and substantial offering set it apart in the candy world, making it a treat to savor. Despite the changing tastes and trends in confectionery, Chunky chocolate bars have maintained their appeal, continuing to offer a bite of nostalgia and a reminder of the simple pleasures of a well-crafted candy bar.
The first time someone told you the recipe, you didn't believe them. Grape jelly and chili sauce, equal parts, stirred together in a slow cooker with frozen meatballs dropped right in. That was it. No stock, no wine, no technique anyone would call refined. But by the time those meatballs had simmered for 2 hours in that strange, glossy sauce, something had happened that no one could explain. The sweet and the tangy had merged into a glaze so addictive that people stood over the crock pot with toothpicks and didn't move until the pot was scraped clean. Cocktail meatballs were a fixture of 1970s party tables, showing up at Super Bowl gatherings, office potlucks, and holiday open houses across the country. Some cooks used grape jelly with Heinz chili sauce. Others swapped in cranberry sauce or apricot preserves. A few added a splash of soy sauce for depth. The recipe spread hand to hand, always whispered like a secret nobody wanted to admit they loved, because admitting you loved grape jelly on meatballs felt like admitting something about yourself you weren't ready to say. Pizza toast on white bread was what every American kid made in the years before bagel bites, and it was better in every way that mattered. You spread contadina or Hunt's tomato paste, not pizza sauce, not marinara, but the concentrated paste from the small can, across a slice of white bread, covered it with shredded mozzarella, and slid it under the broiler. 4 minutes watching. The cheese went from white to spotted to pulling away at the corners, and when it browned at the edges while still soft in the center, it was ready. Bagel Bites launched in 1985, created by two brothers in Hallandale, Florida, and within a few years became the commercial standard for after-school pizza snacking. Before that, the pizza toast was what you made yourself, how much paste, how thick the cheese, whether to shake oregano from the jar above the stove. The homemade version didn't disappear because it was inferior. It disappeared because the commercial one required no watching. Persimmon pudding required patience and timing. You had to wait for the first hard frost, because before the frost, the wild persimmon was astringent enough to dry your mouth out for an hour. After the frost, it turned soft and honey-like, and you pressed it through a colander to get the pulp. Mixed with sugar, eggs, buttermilk, and flour, it baked into a dense, dark pudding served cold from the windowsill. Smooth and rich, tasting of autumn and something wild underneath. Wild persimmons are native to the eastern United States. The frost ripening requirement was noted by early European explorers who ate them too soon and regretted it. Mountain families knew the rule by feel. You picked them after the black frost, not before. The woman who kept that calendar is gone. The persimmon trees still fruit every fall. Nobody times the picking right anymore. Number 15. Coconut candy balls. Sweetened shredded coconut was one of the few exotic ingredients available in rural general stores by the late 1950s, and women across the Ozarks of Missouri and Arkansas learned quickly that a can of sweetened condensed milk, a bag of coconut, a handful of powdered sugar, and a few drops of vanilla made a candy that required no cooking at all. You mixed the coconut and sweetened milk until it would hold a shape, rolled it into small balls, and set them on waxed paper to firm. Some women dipped them in melted chocolate, some rolled them in more coconut, some left them plain. In the Baptist church communities of the Arkansas Hill Country, these appeared on every covered dish table during the Christmas season. A can of sweetened condensed milk cost about 25 cents in 1961. That single can made 3 to 4 dozen pieces. That is a Christmas plate for under $1. The hot, open-faced turkey sandwich was what the week after Thanksgiving looked like before anyone invented the leftover pot pie. It was also what Tuesday looked like in any decade when whole turkeys sold for under $1 a pound, which through the post-war years into the 1970s they often did. Sliced roast turkey laid over white bread, then the giblet gravy. Neck and giblet simmered an hour before the bird went in, the stock thickened with a flour roux, finished with the pan drippings poured generously. Television dinners of the era tried to replicate this in aluminum trays. They failed. The difference was the turkey drippings. That slightly sweet, mineral-depth chicken drippings never matched, and the way the bread absorbed at the edges while holding structure at the center. The TV dinner industry understood the concept. It could not replicate the smell of the kitchen in the 20 minutes before this hit the table. Hardtack. Christmas candy was the sparkling jewel of holiday tables, especially in the mid-20th century when homemade candies meant more than anything wrapped in foil. The process looked almost like magic to children. You heated sugar, water, and corn syrup until the mixture turned clear and glass-like, then added bright colors and simple flavors that filled the house with scents of cinnamon, clove, or wintergreen. Once the syrup reached that boiling point of no return, you poured it onto a buttered pan and waited for it to cool just long enough to cut. But here was the part that made it special. You dusted the finished cubes in powdered sugar so they would not stick together, and suddenly you had a bowl full of tiny stained glass windows that seemed too pretty to eat. Hardtack candy became a symbol of the season because it was cheap, cheerful, and long-lasting. It sat in candy dishes for weeks, ready for guests, children, or whoever wandered by. You rarely see people making it today because it requires patience, precision, and a certain tolerance for sticky countertops. Candy stores still sell versions of it, but the homemade kind had a subtle warmth, a simpler sweetness, and a charm that commercial versions cannot imitate. Hardtack was the kind of candy you remembered long after the tree came down, partly for its taste and partly for how it made the season feel fuller. Rule was the recipe: 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, 1 envelope of dry onion soup mix, a cup of long grain rice, a cup and a half of water, chicken pieces on top, lid sealed with foil, 90 minutes at 350. Do not open it. Open the lid at 45 minutes and the steam escaped, the rice went dry, and you came back to something nobody wanted. The title was the entire instruction set, No Peak Chicken and Rice, and every cook who made it had a story about someone who peaked, told with the satisfaction of patience, vindicated. It spread through church cookbook fundraisers across the 1970s because it asked almost nothing and delivered every time. It is strange to explain to someone raised on instant read thermometers that a dish could require only restraint, and that restraint alone was sufficient. That same butter from the cheese ball found its way into a saucepan the next morning, melted with brown sugar, corn syrup, and a pinch of salt until it bubbled into something golden. Homemade caramel corn started with plain popped kernels and a batch of stovetop caramel poured hot over the popcorn in a roasting pan. You stirred it with a wooden spoon, then slid it into a low oven, 250, for a full hour, pulling it out every 15 minutes to turn it. The baking soda was the secret. Half a teaspoon whisked into the caramel right before pouring made the coating puff up light and crisp instead of turning hard as glass. Families folded in roasted peanuts at the end, their own version of Cracker Jack, years before it came in foil bags at the convenience store. A pan cost less than $1 in 1973 and fed a living room full of kids without a single complaint.
Since their grand debut in 1930, Twinkies have danced their way into the hearts of Americans, becoming a beloved snack legend. Their ability to adapt to ingredient shortages during wartime highlighted the brand's resilience and ingenuity. Originally filled with banana cream, a wartime banana shortage necessitated a switch to vanilla cream, a change that contributed to the snack's iconic status. Twinkies became known for their longevity and adaptability, surviving changes in consumer preferences and even a brief discontinuation in 2012. Today, they remain a beloved treat, embodying the comfort and nostalgia of American snack food with their golden sponge cake and creamy filling, continuing to delight generations of snackers.
If Rumaki proved you weren't afraid of anything, clam dip proved you didn't need to try that hard. A can of minced clams drained and folded into softened cream cheese with lemon juice, Worcestershire, and garlic powder. That was the whole thing. And in the 60s and 70s, it showed up at nearly every gathering along the eastern seaboard. The dip had roots in New England, where canned clams were cheap and cream cheese held anything together. Some used sour cream instead. A few coastal cooks stirred and prepared horseradish for bite. You served it cold with Triscuits, and it was always the first thing gone. Manufacturers sold pre-made clam dip in aluminum containers through the 70s, but by the 90s, salsa had taken its place entirely. The tins vanished from dairy cases, and the homemade version went with them. One more cold dip from an era when cream cheese and a can of something could make you the most popular person at the party. Eating cereal dry was not a snack you invented. It was something you discovered, usually by accident, when you opened the box intending to pour it and then just didn't bother with the milk. Lucky Charms, Cap'n Crunch, Cocoa Puffs, whatever was in the cabinet, eaten by the handful straight from the bowl. The marshmallows in Lucky Charms were better dry. Everyone who grew up in the 1980s knew this, and nobody said it out loud because it seemed too obvious to mention. You picked out the marshmallows first, ate them separately, then finished the grain pieces as a kind of bland dessert. Cap'n Crunch was the dangerous one. The squares cut the roof of your mouth if you let them sit too long on your tongue. You developed strategies. Nobody taught you. By the early 1990s, cereal companies had begun marketing certain varieties explicitly as dry snacks, which meant the private discovery had become a product strategy. Morel mushrooms fried in butter were called dry land fish in Appalachia, and that name tells you how they were valued: rare, seasonal, found only by people who knew where to look, and tasting like something richer than anything grown in a garden. Morels pushed up through the leaf litter in spring near dying elm trees or old apple orchards, and the people who knew where they grew kept that knowledge with them. You fried them in butter in a cast iron skillet for about 4 minutes, the edges crisping and the hollow interior steaming. The result tasted like concentrated forest, earthy and rich and slightly meaty. The honeycomb-capped mushrooms have been foraged in North America since long before European settlement. French colonial documents noted that native populations dried them for winter storage. By the 1970s, morel hunting in Appalachia was a serious spring activity. Families went out at first light to check their known spots. The spots were never written down. You learned them by following someone who knew. Number 11. Honeycomb sponge candy. In the beekeeping communities of the Upper South, the Carolinas, Tennessee, the Virginia mountains, honeycomb candy was made from the sorghum and cane that the bees hadn't gotten to. You cook the sugar syrup to the hard crack stage and then drop in a spoon of baking soda at the very last second. The soda reacts with the heat and causes the candy to foam and expand into a golden lattice of tiny bubbles, like frozen amber. You pour it fast into a greased pan and do not touch it. When it cools, you break it into irregular pieces. The inside is light as air. The outside shatters like glass. In mountain communities of North Carolina, older residents called it sea foam or angel food candy, and it appeared every Christmas. The ingredients cost almost nothing. The technique required courage and speed. A woman who made good honeycomb was known for it throughout her community, and she knew she was known for it. The knowing was part of the pleasure. Hot open-faced roast beef, white bread flat on a plate, overlapping slices of Sunday's leftover roast beef, then the gravy brown and glossy from drippings, flour, and beef stock, poured so generously the bread disappeared beneath it, was the kind of meal that required a fork and a knife but cost less than $1.50 and still felt like effort. In the upper Midwest, they called it a commercial. Beef commercial, turkey commercial. Diner shorthand on menus from Minnesota to Wisconsin through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. You ordered it because it was cold and the mashed potatoes cost 30 cents extra, and you always got them. The home version was made on Mondays from Sunday's roast. The drippings scraped from the refrigerator where they'd solidified overnight into a rust-colored disc that smelled of everything good the oven had done to the meat. When the Sunday roast stopped, this disappeared with it. Potato candy rolls were the kind of Christmas treat that made people raise an eyebrow until they tasted one, and then suddenly they wanted the recipe like it was magic. These candies came from a time when nothing went to waste, not even leftover mashed potatoes. Mothers mixed those cold potatoes with powdered sugar until a dough formed, something that amazed every child watching. After rolling it flat, they spread peanut butter on top and rolled it into a tight log. Sliced into spirals, each piece looked like a fancy cookie, even though it was made from the humblest ingredients. Children loved them, adults appreciated them, and they were perfect when budgets were tight, but spirits were high. Today, people turn their noses up at the idea, forgetting what creativity and resourcefulness can taste like. But anyone who grew up with those sweet little spirals knows they had a charm no store-bought candy could ever match. Nobody called it a recipe. There was ground beef and potatoes in the bin, and that was the plan. The beef browned with diced onion, broken up but left with some texture. Some fat stayed in the pan deliberately. Flour stirred through until it disappeared, then beef broth poured slowly, pulling up everything the beef had left behind on the bottom. 3 minutes over medium heat, and it thickened into something dark, glossy, and full of depth that no gravy packet ever replicated because the flavor was in the fond, the browned bits, and you only got those by starting with the meat itself. Over hand-mashed potatoes, salt, and butter, nothing else. 20 minutes total. The house smelled like someone was paying attention. She never named what she did between the browning and the broth. You figured it out years later, alone in your own kitchen, the moment the gravy hit the right color and sheen, and felt something that was difficult to name, but that had her in it. In the South, pimento cheese wasn't something you bought. It was something your family made, and everybody's recipe was a little different and a little sacred. Sharp cheddar grated by hand on a box grater, a jar of diced pimentos drained and folded in, enough mayonnaise to bind it, Duke's, never Miracle Whip, and sometimes a pinch of cayenne or a shake of garlic powder that nobody mentioned out loud. You could spread it on white bread or pile it on crackers, but at holiday tables through the 1960s and 70s, it got piped into celery grooves and arranged on trays alongside the olives and the pickles. Bridge clubs served it on silver platters. Church suppers set it out in cut glass bowls. The women who made the best pimento cheese were known by name, and their recipes stayed in the family, written on index cards in pencil, passed from mother to daughter with no measurements, just instructions like enough mayo to make it smooth and taste it, you'll know. The jars on grocery shelves now taste nothing like what came out of those kitchens.
Beechnut fruit stripe gum dazzled the 1960s with its rainbow of flavors and whimsical tattoos, making each stick an adventure in taste and temporary art. The vibrant colors of the gum strips matched their fruity flavors, making each piece a visual and taste sensation. The inclusion of temporary tattoos in each pack added to its appeal, offering more than just a chewing experience. Despite its flavors being short-lived, Fruit Stripe Gum's vibrant packaging and the fun of the temporary tattoos have left a lasting impression on those who grew up with it, evoking fond memories of a simpler time when even a stick of gum could bring a burst of joy and color to a child's day.
Nobody admitted it was just 2 ingredients. That was the unspoken agreement of every 1970s party. You brought the dip, someone complimented it, and you accepted the praise like you'd spent hours in the kitchen. Lipton onion soup dip was 1 envelope of dried soup mix stirred into a pint of sour cream, chilled, and set out with ridged potato chips. Kraft printed the recipe on the packet in 1958, calling it California Dip, and within a decade it was the most popular dip in America. By the 70s, it showed up at every barbecue, every card party, every Super Bowl gathering, always in the same ceramic bowl, always with ruffles strong enough to hold a loaded scoop. Some women added a spoonful of mayo, others folded in chives. The base never changed, and the compliments never stopped. The pre-made dip aisle killed it, but the jar version never tasted the way hers did, and everybody knew it. Cream cheese on date nut bread was a snack that belonged to grandmother's kitchens and church bazaars, the kind of place where the bread came wrapped in wax paper and sat on the counter all week. Date nut bread, dense and dark with the sweetness of medjool dates and the crunch of pressed walnuts, was sold in small cylindrical loaves through the 1960s and 70s. You spread Philadelphia cream cheese on those rounds the way you'd spread it on a bagel, only thicker. Philadelphia cream cheese had been produced since 1872, originally made in Chester, New York by dairyman William Lawrence, and by the 1980s it was the default American spread for anything needing richness without effort. The cream cheese against the sweet, heavy date crumb created something far more considered than it was. By the 1980s, Date nut bread had started its long disappearance from bakery shelves, pushed out by muffins and convenience loaves. The grandmother who kept it stopped buying it when it became hard to find, and then she was gone too. A moon pie and an RC cola carried a price and a history. The marshmallow-filled graham cracker sandwich coated in chocolate or banana, paired with Royal Crown, cost under a dime apiece at the company store. The moon pie was created in 1917 at the Chattanooga Bakery in Tennessee when a traveling salesman visited a coal camp and asked what miners wanted. Something big, filling, cheap enough to eat on a break. They held their hands in a circle and described it the size of the moon. By the 1970s, every mountain child knew the ritual. One bite of moon pie, then a long pull of cold RC. The carbonation cut through the marshmallow in a way no other drink could match. Pepsi was wrong. Coke was wrong. RC was the one. Old men at the filling station did this the same way on a Tuesday in 1972 they had in 1952. When the company store closed and the stool went with it, the man who always sat there went too. The moon pie is still on the rack. The rest of it is gone. Number 17. Buckeyes. Named for the nut of the Ohio State tree, Buckeyes are chocolate-dipped peanut butter balls that became a Midwest tradition starting in the early 1960s. The original version used nothing more than peanut butter, powdered sugar, and a little butter worked into a dough, rolled into balls, and dipped partially in melted chocolate so that a circle of the peanut butter filling showed at the top, just like the real Buckeye nut. Home economists in Columbus and Dayton documented the candy in church cookbooks as early as 1960. A pound of peanut butter cost about 35 cents. A bag of chocolate chips added another 20 cents. The whole batch made 40 to 50 pieces. That is candy for a family of 6 for under 60 cents, and it looked like something that took far more effort than it did. That gap between how hard it looked and how easy it was is something your grandmother understood very well. Before anyone questioned whether a frozen fish stick belonged between 2 slices of white bread, there was a generation of children who knew exactly how good it was. If the roast was Sunday and the gravy was Monday, the fish stick sandwich was Wednesday. Gorton's of Gloucester, Massachusetts, which introduced frozen fish sticks during the 1950s as part of the first wave of foods marketed during the television advertising boom, crispy and mild and completely acceptable to children who refused anything that smelled too strongly of the sea. Sticks baked until the coating cracked, transferred hot onto soft white bread with tartar sauce from a jar. The bread steamed slightly against the heat, which was the whole point. That warmth transferring through, making it part of the meal instead of just its container. These were after-school sandwiches, lunchbox sandwiches, the sandwiches of households where the freezer did serious work. They went quiet when families decided frozen fish sticks were beneath them. Peppermint stick bark looked like Christmas had shattered into little edible pieces, and for years it was one of the easiest candies families made. Before bark became polished and commercial, it was something homemade and joyfully messy. Someone would crush peppermint sticks inside a towel with a rolling pin, filling the room with the scent of mint. Then white chocolate was melted slowly on the stove, stirred until smooth, and mixed with those peppermint shards until the whole pot sparkled. Spread on a baking sheet and cooled, it broke into uneven pieces that tasted crisp and wintry. Children loved the crunch, adults loved the nostalgia, and everyone loved how something so simple felt so festive. Store-bought bark exists now, but homemade versions had charm in their imperfections. It was a reminder that Christmas candy did not need to be fancy. It just needed someone willing to make a sweet little mess in the kitchen. When convenience cuts became the default in the 1980s, cacciatore stopped delivering. Most cooks let it go without a eulogy. Long before Tuesday needed a theme, American chop suey was already solving the problem. Ground beef, elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, onion, everything in one pan until the pasta absorbed the liquid. The name borrowed from Chinese cooking, chop suey, appeared in print as early as the late 1800s, derived from Cantonese for a little of this and that. But the dish had no connection to any Chinese kitchen. In New England, it was simply chop suey. In the Midwest, they called it American goulash. In Ohio, it became a baked casserole called Johnny Marzetti. You could tell where someone was raised by what they called it, and whether cheese went in at the end, and whether the green pepper was required or optional. Nobody agreed on any of it. Everybody's mother made the only correct version. The dish has never entirely gone, but the name has mostly faded. Most people under 30 call it pasta with meat sauce, unaware they're eating something that fed entire neighborhoods for most of a century. She melted the butter first, always a full stick in the biggest pot. Low heat, never rushing it. Then the marshmallows went in. A whole bag stirred slow until everything turned smooth and white, and the kitchen smelled like warm sugar. Rice Krispies treats had lived on the back of the Kellogg's box since 1940, but through the 70s they were still made from scratch in nearly every kitchen with children. 6 cups of cereal folded in, then pressed into a buttered pan with greased hands. The trick was pressure. Too hard and they turned to bricks. Not enough and they crumbled when you cut them. The ones that were perfect, crisp edges, soft and sticky center, came from hands that had done it 100 times without thinking. They showed up at bake sales for $0.25, in lunchboxes wrapped in wax paper, on counters cooling under a dish towel. You can buy them in plastic wrappers now. They taste like nothing anyone remembers.
Since the swinging 60s, Hostess fruit pies have been pocket-sized parcels of joy, bursting with fruity goodness. Their handheld design made them a convenient option for on-the-go snacking without sacrificing flavor. These pies became the quintessential treat for those on the move, marrying convenience with the classic flavors of home-baked desserts. The addition of comic book advertisements further cemented their place in popular culture, making them a nostalgic treat for many. Despite changes in the snack food landscape, Hostess fruit pies remain popular, continuing to offer a sweet slice of nostalgia.
You measured nothing. A handful of peanuts, a handful of raisins, M&Ms poured in until the color looked right. Then you shook the bag and called it done. Gorp, good old raisins and peanuts, was the original trail mix. And through the 70s, it went everywhere families did. Into backpacks on scout trips, into station wagons on cross-country drives, into brown bags beside thermoses at Little League games. The combination of nuts, dried fruit, and chocolate as portable hiking food traces to at least the 1910s, when outdoorsman Horace Kephart recommended a similar mix in his camping guide. Every family had a version. Sunflower seeds, coconut flakes, butterscotch chips instead of chocolate. The only rule was, you made it yourself and made enough to share. When trail mix appeared in pre-made bags at the gas station in the 80s, it stopped being something you assembled around the kitchen table. Nobody fought over the last handful of a gas station bag the way they fought over their mother's gorp. Stovetop caramel popcorn required patience, and most kitchens that made it in the 1970s and 80s had plenty of the will, but not always the skill, which is why there were so many batches that came out too sticky, too dark, or hardened into an unmovable mass. You popped the corn in a covered pot, poured it into the largest bowl in the house, then cooked butter, brown sugar, and corn syrup in a saucepan until it reached what cooks called the soft crack stage, between 270 and 290 degrees Fahrenheit. You poured the caramel over the popcorn and tossed fast before it set. The woman who made it right could tell the temperature by the color of the syrup and the way it fell from the spoon. No thermometer. Cracker Jack had been selling commercial caramel corn since 1896, but the homemade version off a gas burner tasted nothing like it. That particular stovetop skill stopped being passed down sometime in the 1980s, and caramel popcorn became something you bought. Peanut butter and Caro syrup fudge was made in a bowl without a stove, a thermometer, or much patience. Spoon peanut butter into a bowl, pour Caro corn syrup over it, stir until it stiffened into a dense, sticky mass that held its shape when you pinched off a piece. That was the candy. Hard in the refrigerator, soft in a warm kitchen, eaten off the fingers or rolled into balls and dusted with powdered sugar. Mountain women called it poor man's fudge, which was accurate. Real chocolate fudge required a candy thermometer and cream, neither guaranteed. Caro and peanut butter were always in the cabinet. Corn syrup had been a staple in Appalachian kitchens since the early 20th century when cane sugar was too expensive and peanuts from the Piedmont lowlands made peanut butter an affordable staple. Two cheap ingredients, one snack better than anything fancy. The women who made it never measured. You could not get it right if you measured. Number 13. Sugared pecans. In the pecan belt, central Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the eastern edge of Texas, a woman with a pecan tree in her yard could make candy for almost nothing. She beat an egg white until foamy, tossed pecan halves in it, then tumbled them in a mixture of sugar, cinnamon, and a pinch of salt. She spread them on a greased baking sheet and put them in a slow oven until the coating baked hard and glossy. The pecans cost nothing. The egg was from the yard chickens. A cup of sugar in 1963 cost about a nickel. A full pan of sugared pecans, enough to fill a tin box, cost about 20 cents to make. In rural South Georgia, families with trees put up 3 or 4 tins every December, one for the house and the rest to take to neighbors, to the church, to elderly women who could not get out. The gift was not extravagant. It fit inside the economy of a community that gave what it had. If you grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, you know what an egg foo young sandwich is. If you grew up anywhere else, you've never heard of it. An egg foo young patty, eggs beaten with bean sprouts, scallions, and pork, pan-fried in a loose disc, between 2 slices of white bread with mayonnaise, lettuce, and dill pickles, a combination that should not have worked but absolutely did. The sandwich took root in St. Louis in the 1940s when Chinese-American restaurants began adapting for Midwestern customers who wanted familiar flavors in portable form. The briny pickle against the savory egg was the whole argument for its existence. By the 1970s, it was a fixture at old-school St. Louis lunch counters, surviving into the 80s before gradually fading. A handful of establishments still make it today. Everywhere else, it simply never happened. A community's gift to its neighbors that never reached the rest of the country. Chocolate-covered orange peel was one of those Christmas treats that turned something ordinary into something extraordinary. Before stores sold candied citrus, families peeled oranges in long strips and simmered the rinds in sugar syrup until they softened and glowed. The house filled with the smell of citrus and warm syrup, and children poked at the pot hoping the pieces were ready. Once dried, the peels were dipped in melted chocolate, dark, or milk, depending on what the pantry allowed. The combination was unforgettable: bitter peel, bright orange flavor, and smooth chocolate. Families once set trays near cold windows to help the chocolate harden. The tradition faded as candy making became commercial, but this treat still carries the charm of quieter holidays when nothing went to waste. The corned beef and cabbage that Irish-American families made on Sundays held an irony at its center. In Ireland, pork was the traditional meat, not beef. Corned beef entered the tradition after immigrants in New York discovered that Jewish delicatessens in their neighborhoods offered cured beef brisket at prices cheaper than the salted pork they had known at home. And the substitution became the tradition. A whole brisket simmered for 3 hours with peppercorns and bay leaves, then cabbage in wedges, potatoes and carrots added in the final 45 minutes. The cooking liquid was the broth that flavored everything, slightly salty, faintly peppery, carrying 3 hours of what the beef had given up. Grainy mustard alongside, nothing else required. The whole pot fed 8 people for very little, which was the point before it became the ritual, and then it became both at once. She made it every March without being asked. Nobody does anymore, and March feels different for it. Most people today wouldn't touch it, and that's exactly why it belonged on every serious cocktail tray in the 70s. Rumaki was chicken livers and water chestnuts marinated in soy sauce and brown sugar, wrapped in bacon, pinned with a toothpick, and broiled until the bacon crisped and the liver turned velvety. The dish was born at Don the Beachcomber in Palm Springs around 1941, riding the tiki wave that swept American entertaining for 3 decades. Trader Vic's put it on menus and it spread into rec rooms across the country. The contrast was everything. The crunch of water chestnut against rich liver, smoke of bacon against sweet marinade. Making a full tray meant handling raw liver without flinching, which separated the hosts who were serious from the ones who just opened a bag of chips. By the 80s, organ meats fell out of favor and rumaki disappeared almost overnight. from the center of the table to something most people have never heard of.
Shake-a-pudding shook up the 60s snack scene, turning dessert preparation into an interactive spectacle. Its DIY approach to dessert tapped into the growing do-it-yourself culture of the time, making it a fun family activity. This easy-to-make dessert offered families a fun and interactive way to prepare a snack, combining the simplicity of shaking with the satisfaction of creating something delicious. The novelty of Shake-a-Pudding, along with its reflection of space-age optimism, made it a memorable part of the culinary landscape. Its disappearance from the market has not diminished the fond memories of those who enjoyed the unique experience of making their own pudding, showcasing the lasting impact of innovative snack solutions.
Before there were bags of it on every shelf, Chex Party Mix was something you made at home, and every household had a version that was fiercely different from everyone else's. The base was always the same: rice and wheat Chex tossed with pretzel sticks and mixed nuts in a roasting pan. Then came the coating: melted butter, Worcestershire sauce, garlic salt, and onion powder stirred until the kitchen smelled sharp and warm. You baked it at 250 degrees, stirring every 15 minutes for almost an hour. The recipe ran on the back of the Chex box starting in the late 1950s, but by the 70s, every mother had her own adjustments: a splash of Tabasco, a handful of sesame sticks, a dusting of seasoned salt that made hers the one people asked for at church potlucks. You knew whose batch you were eating without being told. Nobody makes it from scratch anymore. The bags are easier, but they don't smell like her kitchen did. Cottage cheese with canned peaches was the after-school snack that arrived with the 1970s fitness wave and stayed through the 80s without ever becoming fashionable, which is how most genuinely useful things work. You spooned large curd cottage cheese into a bowl, always large curd, never small, then opened the Del Monte or Dole can of sliced peaches in heavy syrup and laid them over the top without draining. The syrup ran into the curds and pooled at the bottom of the bowl. Cottage cheese had been marketed as diet food since the early 1970s, when the first serious American fitness movement made its push into everyday life, and the peach pairing was that era's answer to dessert for the disciplined. It tasted better than it sounded. But the woman who kept both a carton of cottage cheese and a row of Del Monte cans simultaneously ready, always both, always waiting, is the part that's gone. Salt-rising bread was not made on a schedule. It rose when it wanted to. An honest description of bread that relied on naturally occurring bacteria captured in cornmeal, milk, and salt, left to ferment overnight near the wood stove. The smell alarmed anyone who had not grown up with it: sharp, cheesy, faintly like old feet. And that smell meant it was working. Baked, the crumb was dense and tangy, the structure tight enough to toast to a hard golden crunch. Buttered while hot, it was an event. Salt-rising bread originated in Appalachia as a solution to expensive commercial yeast, and mountain bakers in West Virginia and Kentucky had kept the skill alive since before the Civil War. By the 1970s, the women who still made it by feel, reading the smell to know if the ferment had turned, were running short on apprentices. You did not learn it from a cookbook. You stood in the kitchen and watched and smelled, or you never learned at all. Number 23. Chocolate drops. There was no Hershey's in most rural Appalachian kitchens, but there was cocoa powder, and cocoa powder was enough. A woman in Harlan County would measure out 2 tablespoons of cocoa, combine it with sugar, a small knob of butter, and a splash of milk, bring the whole thing to a boil, then drop it by spoonfuls onto wax paper. She didn't call it fudge. She called it chocolate candy, and she made it in under 15 minutes on top of the stove. A tin of cocoa powder cost about 30 cents in 1961, enough for 3 or 4 batches of drops. No oven, no fancy equipment, just a pot, a spoon, and enough confidence to know when the mixture was ready by the way it smelled. In mill communities across the Piedmont of North Carolina, this same method produced peanut butter drops by swapping out cocoa for peanut butter. Your grandmother did not need 2 recipes. She needed 1 pot and whatever was in the cabinet. The hot dog split down the middle and broiled with cheese answered the question of what to do when the buns ran out or when someone wanted something hot without starting a whole production. A standard ballpark or Oscar Mayer cut lengthwise without going all the way through, the interior pressed open, a line of yellow mustard laid in, then a strip of American cheese folded into the groove. The whole thing slid under the broiler until the cheese bubbled and the hot dog skin tightened and split at the edges. Some households put it back in a bun afterward. Others served it without, the hot dog standing alone on the plate with the cheese pooled in the split. An open-faced situation that required a fork and constituted a real meal in the households that served it that way. Children learned which version their household made and understood the other version was wrong. The correct procedure was not a recipe, it was just how it was done. Caramel pecan turtles were holiday treasures long before companies boxed them in shiny wrappers. The homemade kind began with clusters of pecans arranged on a buttered sheet like tiny turtles with little legs. Warm caramel was spooned over the top, filling the gaps and creating a chewy golden blanket. Once the caramel cooled, each piece was dipped in chocolate, turning simple ingredients into something rich. Families made these every December, often using pecans from their own yards. Children hovered close, hoping for a piece too messy to save. Homemade turtles were never perfect, which made them even better. Mass-produced versions cannot capture the warmth of a kitchen filled with chocolate, caramel, and patience. For many families, turtles were the moment Christmas felt real. European immigrants brought stuffed cabbage to American kitchens in the late 19th century, from Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, and the recipes differed by village and by family. The Hungarian version called for a touch of sugar in the tomato sauce. The Polish sometimes layered sauerkraut beneath the rolls before braising. What all versions shared was the method. A whole head of cabbage into boiling water, outer leaves peeled off one at a time as they softened, each packed with ground beef, raw rice, and onion, tucked and rolled firm. Seam down in a pot, covered in tomato sauce, 2 hours low. The house took on the smell of cabbage softening in tomato. Sweet and slightly funky, a smell that places you in that specific kitchen the moment you encounter it again, decades later. She knew they were done by pressing one roll with the back of a spoon and reading what she felt there. That knowledge existed nowhere on paper. The rolls stopped coming to family tables one generation at a time, the first losing patience for the rolling, the second not knowing the rolling had ever been something to lose. Cheese straws carried the kind of heat that crept up slow, cayenne hidden inside a buttery shell that shattered the second you bit down. The dough was sharp cheddar grated fine, cold butter worked in by hand, a cup of flour, and enough cayenne to give it bite without making anyone reach for water. You rolled it thin, sliced it into narrow strips with a pastry wheel, and baked at 350 until golden, something between a cracker and a shortbread, but entirely savory. The recipe dates to the 19th century in the American South, where cheese straws appeared at everything from afternoon teas to wedding receptions. They hit their stride in the 1970s when finger foods ruled every party. A good batch stored in a tin for a week and still snapped clean when you broke one. The women who made the best ones never shared the exact amount of cayenne. You asked, they smiled, and they changed the subject.
Freaky's cereal leapt onto the breakfast scene in 1972, bringing a motley crew of characters and a bounty of toys that transformed bowls into playgrounds. The playful packaging and marketing of Freaky's cereal appealed to children's imaginations, making breakfast more than just a meal. The inclusion of collectible toys in each box turned breakfast into an exciting adventure, making Freaky's more than just a cereal. This innovative approach to marketing, along with the memorable characters and tasty cereal, created a cult following. While Freaky's may no longer be on store shelves, the nostalgia for this cereal and its whimsical world remains strong, with collectors and fans still cherishing the memories and memorabilia from their childhood breakfasts.
She melted the butter first, always a full stick in the biggest pot, low heat, never rushing it. Then the marshmallows went in, a whole bag stirred slow until everything turned smooth and white, and the kitchen smelled like warm sugar. Rice Krispies treats had lived on the back of the Kellogg's box since 1940, but through the 70s they were still made from scratch in nearly every kitchen with children. 6 cups of cereal folded in, then pressed into a buttered pan with greased hands. The trick was pressure. Too hard and they turned to bricks. Not enough and they crumbled when you cut them. The ones that were perfect, crisp edges, soft and sticky center, came from hands that had done it 100 times without thinking. They showed up at bake sales for a quarter, in lunchboxes wrapped in wax paper, on counters cooling under a dish towel. You can buy them in plastic wrappers now. They taste like nothing anyone remembers. Wonder Bread pinwheels required a rolling pin, a refrigerator, and patience, which is why they felt like an achievement when you got them right. You pressed the rolling pin across a fresh slice until it was almost paper thin, spread it to the edges with cream cheese or thin sliced ham, rolled it tight from one end, and refrigerated it for 20 minutes. Then out, sliced on a diagonal, each round holding its shape. Wonder Bread, introduced by the Taggart Baking Company of Indianapolis in 1921, was specifically engineered soft enough to compress without tearing. The softness critics mocked was the entire structural point. Whole wheat wouldn't roll. Sourdough shattered. The pinwheel was one of the few things a child in the 1980s could make from scratch that looked like party food. The technique required actual skill, feel for the right pressure, the right amount of filling, and once kitchens moved on, no one thought to teach it again. Watermelon with salt on it was the Appalachian summer ritual that every outsider thought was a mistake until they tried it. You did not sprinkle lightly. You put a real pinch directly on the red flesh, let it sit 3 seconds, then ate through that first bite where the salt had drawn the juice out and deepened the sweetness. Mountain children ate it outside on the steps because it ran, and the seed-spitting contests were taken seriously in some households. Sodium enhances sweetness perception by suppressing bitterness. That is why salted watermelon tastes more like itself than plain watermelon, but nobody explained that to the children who did it. They watched adults do it and copied the motion, the same as everything else in those kitchens. The argument about salt on watermelon still starts at reunions. The grandmother who always won it without saying a word is not there to settle it anymore. Number 20. Circus peanuts. Before dollar stores, there was the general store jar. In rural communities across the Midwest, small towns in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, circus peanuts sat in glass jars on the counter of the dry goods store. Orange, banana-flavored, shaped like a peanut but made from nothing a peanut ever touched. They were sold by the piece at about 1 cent each through most of the 1950s and 1960s. Children who grew up in those communities remember them as the candy you got when you had only a penny and couldn't decide. Adults who grew up eating them either love them fiercely or find them baffling. There is no middle ground. The banana flavor came from an artificial extract that was the same formula used in banana-flavored medicine. They were simple. They were cheap. They were everywhere. That was enough. The Reuben made at home told you something about the household's ambitions. You weren't making one unless you were committed. Corned beef from the deli counter, not pre-sliced lunch meat. Swiss, not American. Sauerkraut drained and pressed dry. Thousand Island or Russian dressing depending on which side of the argument you fell on. Dark marble rye buttered on the outside. Everything into a cast iron skillet, weighted, flipped once, pulled when the cheese went glossy and the bread reached walnut shell brown. The origin debate, Arnold Reuben's restaurant in New York, 1914, or Reuben Kulikovsky at the Blackstone Hotel in Omaha in the 1920s, was irrelevant to the families making it on Friday nights. What mattered was the press of the sandwich, the way everything melted together under weight and heat into something that tasted like it had always existed. Without the weight and the heat, you had ingredients. That distinction was the whole recipe. Molasses pull taffy was the kind of candy that transformed the entire household into willing labor because making it took more hands than one person wanted to admit. It began with molasses bubbling on the stove until the kitchen smelled like warm sugar and winter spices. But once it was poured onto a buttered tray, the real chaos began. Children would appear instantly, hands already buttered, ready to pull the taffy even if they had ignored every other chore that day. You stretched the warm rope over and over, folding and twisting it until it lightened into a golden striped ribbon. The room filled with laughter, complaints, and the occasional sticky disaster when someone lost their grip. Long strands were draped over chairs to cool, and the whole house smelled like homemade sweetness. People do not make pull taffy anymore because it takes time, energy, and strong wrists, but older generations still remember it as one of the last truly hands-on Christmas candies, the kind that tasted like effort and family. paprikash arrived through Hungarian immigration and held on for 60 years because it rewarded patience and real ingredients. Bone-in chicken, sweet Hungarian paprika, vivid, almost orange, with a faint sweetness impossible to replicate from the dusty supermarket tin. Butter, onion, sour cream, and nothing else that mattered. 2 heaping tablespoons of paprika into softened butter and onion, stirred until the kitchen changed, then the chicken, broth, lid on, 45 minutes low. The sour cream went in off the heat at the very end, always off the heat, because if it boiled, the sauce broke into something grainy with no recovery. Over wide egg noodles, the color of a late sunset. A Taste of Home recipe credits a grandmother named Alta, whose version used only 5 ingredients, trusting the paprika entirely. It held up. The dish has thinned from general awareness now, but anyone whose grandmother made it will stop mid-step when that specific smell moves through a room. Paprika bloomed in butter, sour cream finishing the pan, and be completely somewhere else for a moment. Long before granola bars and fruit snacks filled the after-school hours, there was bread, butter, and a shaker jar of cinnamon sugar waiting on the counter. You buttered a slice of white bread edge to edge, shook the cinnamon sugar over it thick enough to see brown, and slid it under the broiler with the oven door cracked open so you could watch. 2 minutes, maybe 3, and the butter bubbled up through the sugar until the surface turned golden and the edges crisped. The smell was the whole house. Every kid in the neighborhood knew it. The cinnamon sugar shaker itself was a kitchen fixture, usually a recycled spice jar filled with a mix of 1 part cinnamon to 4 parts white sugar, and it lived next to the stove in every household that had children between 1960 and 1985. It cost almost nothing. It took less time than walking to the corner store. And for a 10-year-old standing at the counter in socks, watching the sugar melt through the oven door, it was the best thing anyone had ever made.
In the 1970s, Figurines diet bars were at the forefront of the health and fitness trend, offering a snack option that didn't compromise on taste. Their slim profile and diet-friendly branding catered to a growing awareness of health and nutrition. These bars provided a guilt-free way to indulge in flavors like chocolate, vanilla, and peanut butter, appealing to those conscious of their dietary choices. Figurines stood out for their focus on calorie control and convenience, marking a significant moment in the evolution of diet snacks. Today, they are remembered for their role in shaping a more health-conscious approach to snacking, blending the desire for indulgence with the need for balance.
She started shaping it the night before, always the night before. The cheese ball was the centerpiece of every 1970s party table, and making one meant softening 2 blocks of cream cheese, folding in sharp cheddar, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and sometimes diced onion. You mixed it by hand, formed it into a round the size of a softball, wrapped it tight, and chilled it overnight so the flavors settled. The next day, you rolled it in crushed pecans until every surface was covered and set it on a plate surrounded by Ritz crackers. Cheese balls in America trace back to 1801, when citizens of Cheshire, Massachusetts, presented a 1,200-pound wheel to President Jefferson. The 70s version was modest, but at every holiday gathering, every cookout, there it sat. The woman who brought the best one knew it, and everyone else did too. Nobody fought over recipes louder than they fought over whose cheese ball belonged at the center of the table. Frozen orange juice popsicles made in ice cube trays with toothpicks came out of the post-war American kitchen, where the chest freezer was new and the idea of making your own frozen treats was still a genuine discovery. You poured diluted Minute Maid concentrate into each slot, 1 can concentrate, 3 cans water, pressed a flat toothpick into the center, and carried the tray level to the freezer. The trick was the toothpick standing straight before the juice started setting. Minute Maid had introduced frozen concentrated orange juice commercially in 1946, a technology developed during World War II to ship juice to troops overseas without spoilage, and by the 1980s it sat in nearly every American freezer. Otter Pops and Fudgsicles were the commercial replacement, cheaper, already frozen, but they tasted like approximations. The toothpick version tasted like what you'd poured into a glass that morning. The real thing, just colder. Black walnut cracking was a community chore that doubled as a snack event, and the mountain method surprised outsiders every time. The walnuts came off trees in green husks that permanently stained everything they touched: skin, clothes, pavement, dark brown black. First step, drive the car slowly over them in the lane to soften the husks. Then a hammer for the hard inner shell. The meat inside was bitter and intensely flavored, nothing like mild English walnuts in any store. You picked it out in small pieces with a nut pick, fingers stained for days, and ate it straight or stirred it into sweet bread cooling on the stove. Black walnuts are native to the Appalachian region. The Cherokee had harvested them for centuries, grinding them into pastes and pressing them for oil. By the 1970s, most households bought walnuts in a bag from the grocery. In the hollows, families still drove over theirs in the lane first. The grandmother who presided always ate the least and picked the fastest, and she made it look easy in a way it absolutely was not. Number 25. Homemade lollipops. When a child in a coal camp in McDowell County, West Virginia wanted candy and there was no penny store within walking distance, a grandmother sometimes made lollipops on the kitchen stove. She boiled sugar, a splash of water, and a drop of extract, peppermint if she had it, vanilla if she didn't, until the syrup went clear as glass. She poured it into greased bottle caps and pressed a toothpick into each one before it set. These weren't pretty. The color was amber or pale yellow. The shape was uneven. But they were sweet, and they were yours. Sugar cost about a dime a pound in 1962 in rural West Virginia. A batch of a dozen lollipops cost almost nothing. Children saved the sticks and compared them the way other kids compared baseball cards. No store-bought candy bar needed, no wrapper to throw away, just a hard knot of sweetness on a stick that lasted all the way home from school. The patty melt disappeared so quietly from home kitchens that nobody noticed it was gone until they looked at a diner menu and felt something like grief. It wasn't a hamburger and it wasn't a grilled cheese. It was the thing in between, which is exactly why it worked. Ground beef pressed into an oval patty on cast iron, then slid onto dark rye with Swiss and caramelized onions that had been going in butter for 20 minutes before the meat touched the pan. The whole thing went back on the griddle, pressed under something heavy, pulled when the bread was dark gold and the cheese surrendered. Patty melts appeared at Tiny Nailor's Drive-In in Los Angeles around 1950 and spread through diner culture over 2 decades, arriving in suburban kitchens by the early 1970s. The rye was the key. That slight sourness cutting through the fat of the beef and the sweetness of the onions. The ones that remember how to make it right are getting harder to find. Old-time opera fudge was the kind of candy that vanished the second it touched your tongue, which made it feel almost magical to anyone lucky enough to try it. It was silky and impossibly light, often served at church bazaars where older women carried the recipe in their heads rather than in any book. Opera fudge was not made like modern chocolate fudge. It started with sugar, cream, and butter, cooked slowly until it reached a stage that required perfect timing. Once the syrup cooled slightly, it was beaten until it thickened and turned matte, taking on its signature texture. Children whispered about whether it would set right this time because opera fudge was unpredictable and dramatic. When it came out correctly, it tasted like soft clouds of vanilla cream. People stopped making it because it demanded patience and precision, and store-bought versions never captured its softness. Those who remember it still talk about it like a first snowfall, something beautiful and fleeting. Shipwreck casserole. Most people over 60 remember it immediately. Most people under 50 have never heard of it. Layers of raw sliced potato, raw onion, raw ground beef, raw rice, and canned tomatoes stacked in a covered casserole dish, nothing cooked first, sealed and put into a 350 oven for 90 minutes. Everything collapsed and fused into something that smelled like a sundae, tasted considered, and required almost no technique. It spread through community cookbooks and church collections across the Midwest and South in the 1960s and 70s, passed between neighbors because it worked and asked nothing. The beef seasoned everything around it. The rice disappeared into the structure. Nothing stayed where you put it, and nothing needed to. At every Thanksgiving spread, every Christmas Eve buffet, every funeral repast in the 70s, a relish tray held its place at the edge of the table, and stuffed celery was always on it. The filling was softened cream cheese beaten smooth, folded with chopped pimento-stuffed green olives and a little of the olive brine for sharpness. You spooned it into the curve of each stalk, then lined them up between carrot sticks and radish roses. The crunch of the celery against the tang of the olives, cold, crisp, and gone before the turkey was carved. Making the relish tray was the job of whoever arrived first, and the women who did it took quiet pride in how neatly the celery was cut, how evenly the filling sat. It was never the star of the table, but its absence was always noticed. The relish tray itself has all but vanished now, and the stuffed celery went with it.
Imagine a dessert that defies gravity, layering itself into a trio of textures as if by magic. Launched into the culinary cosmos in 1969, Jell-O 1-2-3 became an instant classic, with its whimsical layers capturing the imagination of families nationwide. This innovative dessert offered a unique eating experience, from the airy and light top layer to the creamy middle, down to the classic Jell-O jiggle at the bottom. It epitomized the era's fascination with space-age technology, making dessert time a futuristic adventure. Although it has disappeared from store shelves, the legacy of Jell-O 1-2-3 endures, stirring nostalgia for a time when culinary creativity knew no bounds, and a simple dessert could captivate the imagination.
Cheese straws carried the kind of heat that crept up slow, cayenne hidden inside a buttery shell that shattered the second you bit down. The dough was sharp cheddar grated fine, cold butter worked in by hand, a cup of flour, and enough cayenne to give it bite without making anyone reach for water. You rolled it thin, sliced it into narrow strips with a pastry wheel, and baked at 350 until golden, something between a cracker and a shortbread, but entirely savory. The recipe dates to the 19th century in the American South, where cheese straws appeared at everything from afternoon teas to wedding receptions. They hit their stride in the 1970s when finger foods ruled every party. A good batch, stored in a tin for a week and still snapped clean when you broke one. The women who made the best ones never shared the exact amount of cayenne. You asked, they smiled, and they changed the subject. Peanut butter and banana on Wonder Bread was the everyday version of something Elvis Presley had made famous by frying. But in the 1980s, most kids ate it cold and unadorned, pressed flat before being cut into rectangles, never triangles. You spread the peanut butter thick enough to hold the banana slices in place, laid them in a single layer, and ate it standing at the counter before the bread had time to go soggy. The banana had to be ripe, but not soft. A soft banana turned the bread wet in minutes, and you learned that by ruining one. Presley's documented preference was for his version fried in butter with bacon and honey, a recipe associated with his childhood in Tupelo, Mississippi. The cold version your mother made after school had none of that richness. What it had was speed, and it was ready before you'd finished dropping your backpack on the floor. But years before any hillbilly snack came wrapped in cellophane, your grandmother was already in the garden eating tomatoes off the vine with a pocket knife and a salt shaker from her apron pocket. Sun-warmed tomatoes halved over the palm, salted directly on the red flesh. No kitchen, no dishes. The salt drew out the juice immediately. You ate fast, standing between the rows, the warm liquid running down your wrist. Appalachian families grew open-pollinated varieties passed from neighbor to neighbor for generations, softer, thinner-skinned, more acidic than anything bred for shipping. The tomato bled when you cut it. The salt shaker was always in her apron. When she stopped going to the garden herself, nobody thought to put one in their pocket before walking out there. Number 18. Vinegar taffy. The first time someone describes vinegar taffy to a person who has never eaten it, the reaction is usually a look. Vinegar. In candy. But cider vinegar was the acid that balanced the sweetness in old-fashioned taffy when cream of tartar wasn't available, and the result was a candy with a clean, bright flavor that tasted like something between butterscotch and lemon drops. Apple cider vinegar cost about 12 cents a quart in rural Virginia in 1963. The taffy was pulled by hand, one person, two hands, stretched and folded over and over until it lightened in color and turned glossy. In farm communities across the Shenandoah Valley and the Blue Ridge foothills, taffy pulling was a social event. Young people gathered on Saturday evenings, somebody cooked the candy, and the pulling happened with enough noise to keep the house warm. Nobody had to explain the recipe. Everybody already knew it. That is what tradition means. The Kentucky Hot Brown arrived at home tables across the South and Midwest in the years after the Brown Hotel in Louisville closed its doors in 1971, a 12-year shuttering that pushed the dish off its home menu and into home kitchens, where families who remembered the hotel dining room began making their own. Fred K. Schmidt had created the original at the Brown in 1926, open-faced turkey on toast, draped with Mornay sauce, bechamel finished with Parmesan and Romano, then bacon strips, paprika, broiled until the sauce blistered at the edges. The home version substituted sharp cheddar when the proper Mornay felt like too much on a weeknight. It was still extraordinary. The hotel reopened in 1985 and put the original back on the menu. The home versions made during those 14 quiet years were, by most accounts, better. Maraschino cherry fudge was the Christmas candy that looked like it belonged in a stained glass window, thanks to those bright red cherry pieces inside every square. You saw it at potlucks and family gatherings, always stealing attention from the cookies around it. Making it started with warming condensed milk with chocolate until thick and glossy, and then came the cherries. Someone would chop them into tiny pieces, their syrup staining cutting boards and fingertips alike. When stirred in, the fudge turned, swirled, and festive, bubbling softly as it thickened. Once cooled, it formed creamy slices that tasted cheerful and sweet in a way modern desserts rarely do. People stopped making it because trends changed and polished desserts took over, but this fudge had personality. It was bold, bright, messy, and joyful, and every bite tasted like childhood Christmas. The name came from what happened in the pot. Raw, long-grain rice mixed into ground beef, rolled into balls, and when they cooked, the rice swelled through the meat in every direction like quills. Porcupine meatballs dated to the Great Depression, when a quarter pound of beef had to stretch to feed 4, and rice made that math disappear. A can of Campbell's tomato soup thinned with water was the braising liquid. Sweet, tannic, cheap, 30 minutes covered, 30 more uncovered. Genuinely good, tender, savory, the rice adding a chew that made them feel like more than they cost. They appeared on American tables from the 30s through the 70s, outlasting the depression that created them by 4 decades. She made them when money was short, and she didn't want you to know. You didn't. You just ate, and there was always enough. Nobody admitted it was just 2 ingredients. That was the unspoken agreement of every 1970s party. You brought the dip, someone complimented it, and you accepted the praise like you'd spent hours in the kitchen. Lipton onion soup dip was 1 envelope of dried soup mix stirred into a pint of sour cream, chilled, and set out with ridged potato chips. Kraft printed the recipe on the packet in 1958, calling it California Dip, and within a decade it was the most popular dip in America. By the 70s, it showed up at every barbecue, every card party, every Super Bowl gathering, always in the same ceramic bowl, always with ruffles strong enough to hold a loaded scoop. Some women added a spoonful of mayo, others folded in chives. The base never changed, and the compliments never stopped. The pre-made dip aisle killed it, but the jar version never tasted the way hers did, and everybody knew it.
During the disco decade of the 1970s, space food sticks took off like a rocket, igniting dreams of interstellar travel with every bite. They bridged the gap between the fantasy of space exploration and everyday snacking, making them a product of their time. These nutritious, portable snacks were designed for astronauts, offering Earthbound consumers the chance to experience a taste of space adventure. Although no longer in production, the legacy of space food sticks lives on as a symbol of a time when the final frontier seemed within reach, and snacks could be a part of that journey, blending nutrition with the thrill of exploration.
That same butter from the cheese ball found its way into a saucepan the next morning, melted with brown sugar, corn syrup, and a pinch of salt until it bubbled into something golden. Homemade caramel corn started with plain popped kernels, and a batch of stovetop caramel poured hot over the popcorn in a roasting pan. You stirred it with a wooden spoon, then slid it into a low oven, 250, for a full hour, pulling it out every 15 minutes to turn it. The baking soda was the secret. Half a teaspoon whisked into the caramel right before pouring made the coating puff up light and crisp instead of turning hard as glass. Families folded in roasted peanuts at the end, their own version of Cracker Jack, years before it came in foil bags at the convenience store. A pan cost less than $1 in 1973 and fed a living room full of kids without a single complaint. Before instant pudding packets made it a 5-minute job, stovetop vanilla pudding was something you watched someone make from scratch. Milk, sugar, cornstarch, a wooden spoon that never stopped circling the bottom of the pot. You stood at the stove because you were allowed to lick the spoon when it was almost done, and because watching the pudding thicken, going from thin and liquid to thick and glossy, was a kind of slow kitchen magic. By the 1980s, Jell-O instant mixes had taken over most households, but in some kitchens the pudding still came off the stove warm. You ate it straight from the pot before it reached a bowl. Hot vanilla pudding has a depth that the cold, set version loses entirely. The woman who made it that way understood that. She is gone now, and the pot sits unused in a cabinet somewhere. Fried apple hand pies were made from the apples that could not be stored, the soft spot ones, the early fallers, the ones that would not survive winter in the root cellar. Cooked down with sugar and cinnamon, folded into lard-based dough, crimped with a fork, and fried in a cast-iron skillet until both sides turned golden and the filling set hard enough to hold when you bit through. Small enough for one hand, solid enough to last all day in a coat pocket. Mountain families often used dried apples, hung from the rafters through fall, when fresh ones ran out, and the dried version made a sweeter, more concentrated filling. By the 1970s, the younger generation was reaching for Little Debbie pies at the gas station instead. The gas station pie was uniform. Same weight, same sweetness every time. The fried hand pie was different every time depending on who made the dough and how hot the lard ran, which is to say, nobody has gotten it exactly right since the woman who made it stopped making it. Number 14. Candied apples. Before candy apples became a county fair novelty, they were a late autumn treat in farm communities across the South and Midwest, made with apples too small or too tart to eat fresh. A woman in a Tennessee Valley community would take the seconds from the apple harvest, the knobby ones, the ones with soft spots cut out, skewer them on sticks from the woodpile, and dip them in sugar syrup cooked with a handful of Red Hots for color. Red Hots had been sold at general stores in bulk since the 1930s, just a few cents a handful. The apples were free. In farm communities across Appalachia where orchards were plentiful, this was the candy that appeared in late September when the apples came down and the first cold air arrived. Children ate them standing in the yard. The syrup cracked when you bit in. The apple underneath was tart. You ate it down to the core and chewed on the stick. Long before granola bars and fruit snacks filled the after-school hours, there was bread, butter, and a shaker jar of cinnamon sugar waiting on the counter. You buttered a slice of white bread edge to edge, shook the cinnamon sugar over it thick enough to see brown, and slid it under the broiler with the oven door cracked open so you could watch. 2 minutes, maybe 3, and the butter bubbled up through the sugar until the surface turned golden and the edges crisped. The smell was the whole house. Every kid in the neighborhood knew it. The cinnamon sugar shaker itself was a kitchen fixture, usually a recycled spice jar filled with a mix of 1 part cinnamon to 4 parts white sugar, and it lived next to the stove in every household that had children between 1960 and 1985. It cost almost nothing. It took less time than walking to the corner store. And for a 10-year-old standing at the counter in socks, watching the sugar melt through the oven door, it was the best thing anyone had ever made. RC Cola with salted peanuts poured inside the bottle was not invented in any kitchen. It was a tradition discovered on front porches and at country stores, passed from person to person by demonstration, never by instruction. You took a sip or two to make room, tore the corner off a sleeve of Tom's or Lance salted peanuts, and tilted them in slowly. Then you drank and ate simultaneously, each sip carrying 2 or 3 peanuts with it, sweet and salty and carbonated all at once. Food historians trace the practice to Southern textile mill workers in the 1920s who needed a hands-off snack that let them eat without stopping work or washing their hands. Some insisted on Coca-Cola, some swore by RC Cola for its slightly sweeter finish. The combination was called, by people who knew it, the working man's strawberries in Champagne. Most of the country has never tried it. Most of the people who grew up with it don't make it anymore. Potato candy was one of the stranger Appalachian confections. Leftover mashed potatoes, cooled completely, mixed with powdered sugar until a firm dough formed, rolled thin, spread with peanut butter, rolled into a log and sliced into pinwheels. No baking after the potatoes were cooked. The result was a dense, sweet candy with a spiral of peanut butter through the center that tasted nothing like potatoes, which was the whole point. Appalachian potato candy's origins are uncertain. Some food historians link it to German and Irish immigrant communities who brought potato-based sweets from regions where potatoes were plentiful and refined sugar scarce. The earliest versions may have been only mashed potato and powdered sugar, the peanut butter added later. By the 1970s, it showed up at church socials and school bake sales, and people who did not know what it was took one piece and went back for 3 more. It cost almost nothing to make. It tasted like it cost something. Number 12. Ribbon candy. Ribbon candy wasn't made at home. It was the candy you found in the glass jar at the general store, usually around Christmas, always the same. Thin, flat strips of hard sugar candy folded back on themselves in long curves, striped in red and white or green and white. In rural communities across Appalachia and the rural Midwest, the general store jar of ribbon candy was the first sign that Christmas was coming. A penny bought a single piece. A nickel bought 5. Children pressed their faces to the glass counter and pointed. Clay's Candy in South Bend, Indiana made ribbon candy through the entire 1960s using the same hard crack sugar process. In the coalfield communities of southwestern Virginia, women remember bringing ribbon candy to school parties in waxed paper bags, each piece chosen carefully because the colors mattered and the shapes were beautiful, and sometimes that was the only beautiful thing on the table. The tuna melt on an English muffin arrived in American kitchens riding the same wave that brought the English muffin into mainstream grocery stores. Thomas's had begun national distribution through the 1950s, and by the 60s, the Nooks and Crannies pitch had made them a household staple. The combination was almost inevitable. Tuna salad made with Hellmann's, mixed with celery and a little onion, spooned onto a split and toasted English muffin half. A slice of cheddar laid over the top, everything back under the broiler for 3 to 4 minutes until the cheese darkened at the edges. The sound was the whole experience. That faint sizzle when the broiler heat reached the cheese, followed by the smell that filled the kitchen in the last 90 seconds before you pulled it. You could hear when it was ready. The people who knew what they were listening for are mostly gone now. Maple cream candies were the kind of Christmas treat that felt almost too delicate to touch, the sort of candy you picked up with 2 fingers because you were afraid of ruining its perfect little shape. Back when holiday molds were pulled out only once a year, families would make batch after batch of these maple-scented treasures, pouring warm maple cream into tiny molds shaped like angels, bells, trees, or snowflakes. There was nothing artificial about them, nothing rushed or store-bought. Just pure maple syrup cooked slowly with butter and a little cream until it thickened enough to take form. Older cooks knew exactly when to remove the pot from the heat because the scent changed slightly and the bubbles grew heavier. Children would hover close by, praying aloud that someone would let them scrape the sides of the pot once the molds were filled. When the candies cooled, they popped out smooth and pale, each one melting the moment it touched your tongue. The taste was rich but somehow light, like maple sugar dissolved into snow. These candies were often packed into little tins and given to teachers, neighbors, or grandparents, each tin tied with ribbon and smelling faintly like winter cabins and warm kitchens. People do not make maple cream candies as often today because real maple syrup is expensive and patience is in shorter supply than ever. But older generations still talk about them as the candy that made Christmas feel elegant, homemade, and full of intention. They were the kind of treat that asked you to slow down, breathe in the moment, and savor a sweetness that came entirely from nature. They tasted like the quiet side of Christmas, the part that lived in small traditions and thoughtful hands. Tamale pie was the American suburbs translation of a dish that required community and skill. Masa ground fresh, corn husks soaked soft, hands that had learned the right pressure. The translation discarded all of that and replaced it with something a 1970s kitchen could manage on a Wednesday. Ground beef with chili powder and cumin, corn and canned tomatoes, covered with a thick cornmeal batter and baked at 375 until the topping cracked gold. The result was genuinely good. Smoky, slightly sweet, the seasoned beef working up through the crust. What it couldn't carry was the labor the original required. The communal process, the technique learned by watching, not reading. The lard and fresh masa that no shelf staple could replace. Tamale pie appeared in 1972 dinner party menus, alongside sukiyaki and stuffed cabbage as a peer. It faded with the casserole era in the 80s. The tradition it borrowed from never needed to fade, and didn't. The first kernel hit the oil, and you counted. 1, 2, 3. Then the rest followed like a drum roll under a heavy lid. Stovetop popcorn was the sound of a Friday night, made in a deep pot with a few tablespoons of vegetable oil and a quarter cup of yellow kernels shaken hard over a gas flame until the popping slowed to silence. You learned the timing by ear. Too soon, and half the kernels sat unpopped. Too late, and the whole batch scorched. The finish came after. A full stick of melted butter poured slow while you shook the bowl, then enough salt to make your fingers white. Before Orville Redenbacher introduced his gourmet kernels in 1970, this was the only way popcorn happened in most homes. The heavy pot, the oil, the shaking, 5 minutes, almost nothing spent. Kids today will never know what it sounded like to stand in that kitchen, waiting for the last pop.
Hubba Bubba swaggered onto the bubblegum stage in '79, ready to revolutionize the bubble-blowing biz with its non-stick formula and audacious flavors. Its unique formula made it easier for kids to clean up after blowing giant bubbles, enhancing its appeal. Its introduction of bold flavors and engaging commercials featuring bubble-blowing contests quickly made it a favorite among kids and teens. The brand's focus on fun and innovation has helped it maintain a special place in the hearts of those who remember the joy and playfulness of competing to blow the biggest bubble, making Hubba Bubba a symbol of the carefree days of youth.
In the South, pimento cheese wasn't something you bought. It was something your family made, and everybody's recipe was a little different and a little sacred. Sharp cheddar grated by hand on a box grater, a jar of diced pimentos drained and folded in, enough mayonnaise to bind it, Duke's, never Miracle Whip. And sometimes a pinch of cayenne or a shake of garlic powder that nobody mentioned out loud. You could spread it on white bread or pile it on crackers, but at holiday tables through the 1960s and 70s, it got piped into celery grooves and arranged on trays alongside the olives and the pickles. Bridge clubs served it on silver platters. Church suppers set it out in cut glass bowls. The women who made the best pimento cheese were known by name, and their recipes stayed in the family, written on index cards in pencil, passed from mother to daughter with no measurements, just instructions like, enough mayo to make it smooth and taste it, you'll know. The jars on grocery shelves now taste nothing like what came out of those kitchens. Cinnamon toast made under the broiler is not the same as cinnamon toast from a toaster. And if you grew up in a kitchen where someone made it right, you already know that. You laid the bread on the oven rack, spread butter heavy enough to pool in the center, covered it with white sugar, and shook cinnamon over until the color looked right. 30 seconds under the broiler was the difference between a crackling amber crust and a scorched disaster. You watched through the glass. When the sugar bubbled and darkened at the edges, you pulled it out. The broiled method came from Depression-era kitchens where the oven was already on, and it made its way through the decades as the version your mother made when you came home sick from school. The toaster version tastes like seasoned bread. The broiled version tastes like caramelized sugar, a slight char at the crust, butter soaked into every pore. The instinct to use the broiler this way has nearly vanished from American cooking. The cold biscuit with cane syrup needed no recipe, just a leftover cat head biscuit from morning, gone cool on the back of the stove, split with a thumb, filled with a slow pour of sorghum from a tin with a hinged lid. The biscuit soaked it from the inside out. You held it over the sink because it ran. Some families pressed butter in first, so it sealed. Sorghum came from the community press, boiled down in iron kettles every fall. Mountain families relied on it as their primary sweetener because sugarcane never grew at that elevation. By the time the 1970s came around, you could still find Dixie Dew syrup in some cabinets, the label claiming it gave a biscuit a college education, and old-timers found it funny and a little sad that you now had to buy what always came from a neighbor's press. The after-school ritual that needed no permission and no dish went quiet after that. Number 19. Sorghum balls. In the hills of eastern Kentucky and the mountain communities of southwestern Virginia, a candy was made that required no stove and no heat. You measured out sorghum molasses and peanut butter in equal parts, worked in enough powdered sugar to make the mixture firm, and rolled it between your palms into small balls. Then you rolled those balls in cocoa or crushed peanuts or powdered sugar and set them on a plate in the cold pantry to firm up. That was the candy. Sorghum was the sweetener mountain families had when money ran out or the store was too far. A family with a half-acre of cane and access to a community press could make enough molasses to sweeten every dish all winter. The sorghum ball was the candy that required nothing from a store. In Letcher County, children gathered around a wooden table on cold December afternoons and rolled them by the dozens. No stove required, no pots to wash. The French bread pizza sandwich, called a stromboli in Indiana, called nothing in dozens of Midwestern kitchens that made it without naming it, lived at the crossroads of the home pizza craze and the Italian sub-tradition in the 1970s. Nazareno Romano had created the original rolled stromboli in 1950 in Essington, Pennsylvania. What arrived in Midwestern home kitchens was simpler. Italian or French bread sliced lengthwise, pizza sauce from a jar, browned Italian sausage, mozzarella from a block, everything under the broiler until the cheese bubbled and the kitchen smelled like a pizza restaurant. Ground sausage at Nick's English Hut in Bloomington, Indiana, became so well known that alumni still talk about it decades later, and the home version followed. It faded when frozen pizza got cheap enough that making it yourself felt unnecessary, and a generation stopped pulling it from the oven with their own hands. Peanut brittle was one of those candies that made a whole neighborhood smell like Christmas the moment someone poured that molten sugar onto a buttered pan. You could hear it before you saw it too, that sharp crack when someone tapped it with the back of a spoon to test if it had cooled. Back then, making peanut brittle was basically a holiday event that pulled the whole family into the kitchen, whether they planned to help or not. You had to stir that sugar mixture until it turned golden, hoping it did not scorch and ruin the whole batch. The moment you added baking soda, the pot foamed up like a messy science experiment, and everyone either cheered or jumped back a little. Then came the race to spread it thin before it hardened. Some people used wooden spoons, others used their hands wrapped in buttered paper, and some just relied on experience. Once cooled, it cracked into glassy sheets filled with roasted peanuts that always tasted better in December. Store-bought versions exist, but none compared to the loud, sweet, handmade brittle that defined old Christmas kitchens. Vinegar taffy confused people until they tasted it, and then the flavor clicked instantly. The vinegar was never meant to make it sour. It simply balanced the sweetness and added a subtle tang that older generations loved. Before flavored extracts became common, families relied on pantry staples, and vinegar was one of the few ingredients that transformed sugar without overpowering it. You heated the mixture, added that splash of vinegar, and waited for it to reach the perfect stage. Once cool enough, families pulled the taffy until it grew pale and glossy. Some added vanilla or lemon when they had it, but the flavor was always unmistakably simple and comforting. Vinegar taffy faded away as modern candy aisles became filled with bold colors and loud flavors, but this candy belonged to a quieter Christmas. It tasted like resourcefulness and tradition wrapped in sweetness. Before anyone called it a one-dish dinner, stuffed bell peppers already were one. The vegetable was the bowl, the protein was inside, and it came out of the oven complete. You blanched whole green peppers just enough to make them pliable, stood them upright in a baking dish, and filled each with ground beef browned with onion and garlic, folded with rice and tomatoes. Sauce over the top, 40 minutes at 350. The secret was the blanching. Skip it, and the pepper stayed raw and bitter at the center no matter how long it baked, and you learned that mistake exactly once. The dish appeared in 1970s dinner party menus, and across millions of recipe boxes as a dependable weeknight anchor. It never fully disappeared from cookbooks, but it slipped from the weekly rotation when the extra time the blanching required stopped fitting. What replaced it wasn't better. It was just faster, and faster was enough. It looked ridiculous and everyone knew it. Half a grapefruit bristling with toothpicks like a frightened porcupine, each one speared through a cube of cheddar and a chunk of canned pineapple. The cheese and pineapple hedgehog was the appetizer centerpiece that no one took seriously and no one could stop eating. You stabbed the toothpicks into the grapefruit in rows, added glacé cherries or olives for the eyes, and set it on the buffet table where guests circled it with a mix of amusement and genuine hunger. The dish crossed from Britain to American party tables during the 1960s and peaked in the 70s, when themed appetizer spreads and conversation piece food were at their height. Sharp cheddar worked best. The sweetness of the pineapple needed something with bite. Some hosts used Colby or Swiss, and a few daring ones added cubes of ham between the cheese and fruit. Arguments broke out over whether the hedgehog was clever or embarrassing, but the toothpicks were always empty by the end of the night. Nobody makes one anymore. Nobody would admit they miss it either, but they do.
Since 1965, Quisp has been zipping across breakfast tables, its saucer-shaped cereal and quirky alien mascot capturing hearts and taste buds. The marketing of Quisp utilized a blend of humor and science fiction themes, resonating with the space race era's fascination. The engaging adventures of Quisp the alien, brought to life through comic strips and animated commercials, made this cereal a hit. Quisp's innovative marketing and delicious taste created a lasting legacy, making it a beloved icon of pop culture and a nostalgic favorite. The cereal's ability to merge storytelling with a tasty breakfast option has ensured its place in the hearts of those who grew up during its peak popularity, making Quisp a cherished part of cereal history.
3:30 in the afternoon, the screen door banging shut, and there they were. Celery sticks already filled and lined up on a plate. Ants on a log needed no oven, no stove, and no supervision beyond a mother with 10 minutes and a jar of peanut butter. You spread it thick into the groove of each celery stalk, then pressed raisins in one by one until they looked like insects marching in a line. It showed up in home economics classes by the 1960s and became an after-school staple through the next decade. Some mothers used cream cheese instead. A few let their kids assemble their own, which guaranteed twice as many raisins ended up in mouths as on the celery. The crunch, the salt, the sweetness. It was the kind of snack that made you feel like somebody had thought about you before you walked through the door. But if saltine crackers were what you made alone on a slow Tuesday, Velveeta nachos were what happened when someone's older sister decided the whole afternoon needed to be an occasion. Velveeta had been in American kitchens since 1928, engineered by the Monroe Cheese Company to melt smoothly without breaking, a quality that real cheddar could never reliably deliver. By the early 1980s, as Tex-Mex flavor spread into the mainstream, Velveeta found its true calling. You laid tortilla chips across a plate, hacked the block into rough slabs over them, and slid the whole thing into the oven or the microwave. The microwave version came out with orange pooling and a slight skin on top that meant it was done. Real cheese splits, browns, and goes stringy. Velveeta stayed perfect and patient. You can still buy the block, but nobody makes it this way anymore. Chips spread across the plate, the block cut by hand, everyone crowded around before it cooled. Ramp sandwiches on white bread announced themselves before you could see who was carrying one. Ramps, the wild leeks that push up through forest floors in Appalachia every March and April, were pulled from the woods, washed and sliced raw onto 2 pieces of white bread with butter, sometimes salt, nothing else. The smell was somewhere between strong garlic and raw onion, and it clung to everything: hair, clothes, fingers, breath for 2 days. Mountain school districts in West Virginia and Kentucky tolerated the seasonal classroom atmosphere because there was nothing to be done. Whole families had eaten ramps for breakfast and sent their children in smelling like the forest floor. Ramps have been part of Appalachian foodways since the Cherokee used them as a spring tonic after the long winter, and European settlers adopted them immediately as the first green thing available after months of dried provisions. By the 1970s, ramp festivals in West Virginia drew hundreds who came to eat and sell and celebrate the smell. The sandwich was not the point. Getting back to the woods in spring was. Number 24. Caramel corn. On farm kitchens across southern Ohio and northern Kentucky, popcorn was the one crop that always came through. A family could grow a single row and have enough to pop all winter. The caramel that went over it was made in the same heavy pot used for everything else: sugar, sorghum, or molasses, a spoon of butter, a pinch of salt, cooked to the hard crack stage, poured over a pan of popped corn, and spread out to cool on greased butcher paper. The whole batch cost less than 15 cents in 1963. What made it special wasn't the recipe. Every family had the same recipe. What made it special was the night it got made, usually a cold night, usually a Friday, usually with the radio going and children underfoot. Farm families in the Hocking Hills of Ohio and the hill country of eastern Kentucky shaped the same mixture into popcorn balls, wrapped them in waxed paper, and set them in a row on the windowsill like little amber moons. Nobody told you tuna and apple belonged together. You had to discover it by accident at a covered dish supper, eating before anyone explained what was in it. The combination appears in junior league cookbooks and church recipe collections from the era. Star-kissed, drained and flaked, folded into Hellmann's with celery, lemon juice, and half a Granny Smith chopped small. Skippy and Hellmann's ran joint advertising campaigns in the 1970s Los Angeles Herald promoting sweet and savory combinations, validating what home cooks had already figured out. It went on white bread, or sometimes whole wheat if the household had tipped toward the health food movement. The apple browned fast if you didn't move quickly. You made it and ate it that afternoon. She made it every Tuesday after the grocery run. Nobody makes it on Tuesdays anymore. There was a time when divinity candy sat on Christmas tables like something sent from the heavens. And back then, people treated it with the same reverence they gave to holiday hymns. Divinity was not just cooked, it was summoned. You needed a cold, dry day, a calm kitchen, and a whole lot of patience, because one wrong move would turn those soft white clouds into sticky little disasters that refused to hold their shape. Folks today do not realize just how dramatic candy making used to be. Imagine standing over a bubbling pot of sugar syrup, checking the thread stage with nothing but your eyes because candy thermometers were still a luxury. Then you had to pour that lava stream into whipped egg whites at just the right speed or you would ruin it all. And once the candy finally came together, you had seconds to scoop it into neat little mounds before it hardened like cement. Yet when it worked, it was magic. Soft, airy, delicate, and sweet in a way that tasted like snowfall and church choirs. People stopped making it because life got busier and weather never cooperated, but if you ever had real divinity melt on your tongue, you know why families still talk about it like a lost miracle. The applesauce was never from a jar. Rough-cut apples with a cinnamon stick simmering on the back burner, while the bone-in pork chops rendered their fat in cast iron, the rim of each chop pressed flat against the heat until it crisped gold. Salt and pepper only, because the apple was the flavor being built toward. Plated together, the chunky warm sauce, never pured, left rough so you knew it was real, cut through the pork fat in a way nothing bottled ever replicated. The pairing of pork and apple is at least 5,000 years old, and in the 1970s, it was still done from scratch on a Tuesday without ceremony. The bone-in chop has mostly given way to the boneless loin now, quicker and carrying less of what made the original worth eating, and the applesauce comes sealed under foil in 4-packs. She never explained why the scratch version tasted different. She didn't think she needed to. You understood at the table, the way children understand things, not through words, but through being present when something is done right. The first time someone told you the recipe, you didn't believe them. Grape jelly and chili sauce, equal parts, stirred together in a slow cooker with frozen meatballs dropped right in. That was it. No stock, no wine, no technique anyone would call refined. But by the time those meatballs had simmered for 2 hours in that strange, glossy sauce, something had happened that no one could explain. The sweet and the tangy had merged into a glaze so addictive that people stood over the crock pot with toothpicks and didn't move until the pot was scraped clean. Cocktail meatballs were a fixture of 1970s party tables, showing up at Super Bowl gatherings, office potlucks, and holiday open houses across the country. Some cooks used grape jelly with Heinz chili sauce. Others swapped in cranberry sauce or apricot preserves. A few added a splash of soy sauce for depth. The recipe spread hand to hand, always whispered like a secret nobody wanted to admit they loved, because admitting you loved grape jelly on meatballs felt like admitting something about yourself you weren't ready to say.
Marathon bars hitting the shelves in 1973 stretched the very fabric of snack time with their ruler-embellished packaging and a generous 8-inch span of deliciousness. The long-lasting chew of Marathon bars offered consumers a unique and satisfying snacking experience. The combination of caramel and chocolate in a substantial, satisfying bar set it apart from other candy options. Its tagline, "Lasts a good long time," and distinctive packaging made it memorable. Despite being discontinued in the late 80s, Marathon bars are still fondly remembered for their size, taste, and innovative marketing, embodying the era's penchant for snacks that offered something extra.
The first kernel hit the oil, and you counted. 1, 2, 3. Then the rest followed like a drum roll under a heavy lid. Stovetop popcorn was the sound of a Friday night, made in a deep pot with a few tablespoons of vegetable oil and a quarter cup of yellow kernels shaken hard over a gas flame until the popping slowed to silence. You learned the timing by ear. Too soon, and half the kernels sat unpopped. Too late, and the whole batch scorched. The finish came after. A full stick of melted butter poured slow while you shook the bowl, then enough salt to make your fingers white. Before Orville Redenbacher introduced his gourmet kernels in 1970, this was the only way popcorn happened in most homes. The heavy pot, the oil, the shaking, 5 minutes, almost nothing spent. Kids today will never know what it sounded like to stand in that kitchen, waiting for the last pop. Ants on a log sounds like something a camp counselor invented on a dare, but from the 1950s onward, it was the snack that taught American kids that cooking could mean assembly, not heat. You split a celery stalk, dragged a butter knife heavy with peanut butter through the groove until full, and lined the raisins up one by one, never dumping them, always placing, because the spacing was the whole point. The Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink traces the name to a Minneapolis Star-Tribune article from February of 1959, where a family described it as something children had started making themselves. The Girl Scouts had a version in their cookbooks as far back as 1946, though they just called it celery sticks. What the name added was theater. By the 1980s, it had moved from summer camp to every kitchen in America, every kid making it the same way. Deliberate raisin placement, as if rules existed. They did. Nobody wrote them down. Cracklins in a paper bag were not pork rinds, and any mountain child would tell you so without blinking. Real cracklins came from hog butchering day, the skin and fat layer cut into squares, dropped into a boiling lard kettle, and cooked until they puffed and turned golden, the outer shell shattering when you bit through to a chewy, fatty center that tasted like concentrated smokehouse and fire. Shaken in a paper bag with salt while still hot, eaten by the handful while the kettle was still going. There was no second batch, only what came off that hog that day in that yard. The Cherokee in Appalachia had long rendered animal fat as both food and medicine, and European settlers adopted the total-use butchering practice. Fat became lard, skin became cracklins, bones became broth. Store-bought pork rinds are puffed with air and dusted with powder. Cracklins were dense, dark, bitter at the edges where the fat caramelized against the iron. The women who knew how to render them slow are mostly gone. The kettle rusted. Number 22. Molasses popcorn balls. Separate from plain caramel corn, molasses popcorn balls were a late fall tradition across the southern Piedmont and the hill country of Tennessee. After the sorghum press ran and the molasses came in, the first thing many children asked for was a popcorn ball. The molasses gave it a darker, earthier sweetness than plain sugar, heavier, more complex, with a faint tang that no modern candy can copy. You popped the corn first, made the molasses coating, and poured it over the top. You had to work fast because molasses sets quickly. You greased your hands with butter and shaped the balls while the mixture was still warm enough to move. Small hands burned sometimes. A gallon of sorghum molasses in central Tennessee in 1962 sold for about $1.25. That gallon made enough popcorn balls to fill a wash basin. That was the whole point. But before any of those diner sandwiches reached the suburban kitchen, something older had been feeding the Midwest for 50 years already. You couldn't make a loose meat sandwich by accident. You had to know why the meat was supposed to fall apart. Fred Angel opened the first Maid-Rite in Muscatine, Iowa in 1926. Seasoned ground beef cooked slow in beef broth until the liquid was almost gone. Not a patty, not sauced like a sloppy Joe, just loose, crumbly beef spooned onto a steamed bun with yellow mustard and dill pickles. No sauce, no ketchup. The meat was the thing, and the thing about it was restraint, a philosophy that spread across Iowa and into surrounding states through the 1960s and 70s, showing up at high school cafeterias for a quarter and church basements on Friday nights. If you had to ask what held the sandwich together, the answer was nothing. That was the point. Buttermilk pralines were the kind of Southern Christmas candy that tasted like a warm porch swing, a family story passed down, and pure holiday comfort all wrapped into one sugary mound. The recipe looked simple on paper, but anyone who tried making pralines without supervision quickly learned that simplicity was a lie. You had to cook the mixture low and slow, letting the buttermilk, sugar, and butter bubble together until they reached a color that older cooks called just right. No thermometer could tell you that shade, only experience could. Once the pecans were stirred in, the mixture thickened into something rich and creamy, and you had to work fast before it hardened in the pot. People would drop spoonfuls onto wax paper, the pralines spreading slightly as they cooled into little caramel-colored discs with craggy tops. They tasted like brown sugar, toasted nuts, and holidays spent with people who knew how to make something out of nothing. Modern pralines exist in stores now, but they are smooth, tidy, and missing that old-fashioned soul. Buttermilk pralines had personality because the buttermilk added a tangy depth that made them memorable. Older generations made them every December, sometimes as gifts, sometimes for family, and sometimes just because the weather felt right. Over the years, people stopped making them, partly because the process took time and partly because the candy industry swallowed everything homemade. But anyone who has tasted a real buttermilk praline knows why they were worth the trouble. Each bite tasted like memory, patience, and the quiet pride of creating something special without needing anything fancy. The fondue pot came out of the cabinet for company, and everyone understood what that meant. The evening was going to take longer than a regular dinner, drinks were involved, and someone was going to burn their fingers or lose a piece of beef in the oil and claim they hadn't. Fondue bourguignon, the meat version, was a pot of hot oil at the center of the table, each person cooking their own raw cube of sirloin on a long fork, then pulling it through a spread of dipping sauces. The format had been invented by Swiss restaurateur Conrad Egli at his Chalet Suisse restaurant in New York in 1956, and it spread across American dinner party culture through the 1960s and 70s. By 1980, the health-conscious decade had made bubbling oil at the table difficult to justify, and millions of fondue sets went into attics. The sets are still there. The dinners that required 3 hours and everybody present and nobody looking at a phone are harder to locate. She started shaping it the night before, always the night before. The cheese ball was the centerpiece of every 1970s party table, and making one meant softening 2 blocks of cream cheese, folding in sharp cheddar, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and sometimes diced onion. You mixed it by hand, formed it into a round the size of a softball, wrapped it tight, and chilled it overnight so the flavors settled. The next day, you rolled it in crushed pecans until every surface was covered and set it on a plate surrounded by Ritz crackers. Cheese balls in America trace back to 1801, when citizens of Cheshire, Massachusetts, presented a 1,200-pound wheel to President Jefferson. The 70s version was modest, but at every holiday gathering, every cookout, there it sat. The woman who brought the best one knew it, and everyone else did too. Nobody fought over recipes louder than they fought over whose cheese ball belonged at the center of the table.
Since their introduction in 1967, ding-dongs have been a hallmark of indulgence, with their rich chocolate coating and creamy filling. The silver foil wrap also served as a barrier to preserve freshness, ensuring each ding-dong was as delicious as intended. The individual foil packaging added an element of exclusivity and specialness to each cake, making them a coveted treat. Ding-dongs tapped into the growing desire for convenient, delicious snacks that felt like a personal indulgence. Their lasting popularity underscores the enduring appeal of classic snack cakes, reminding us of the joy found in unwrapping and enjoying a chocolatey treat made just for us.
Most people today wouldn't touch it, and that's exactly why it belonged on every serious cocktail tray in the 70s. Rumaki was chicken livers and water chestnuts marinated in soy sauce and brown sugar, wrapped in bacon, pinned with a toothpick, and broiled until the bacon crisped and the liver turned velvety. The dish was born at Don the Beachcomber in Palm Springs around 1941, riding the tiki wave that swept American entertaining for 3 decades. Trader Vic's put it on menus and it spread into rec rooms across the country. The contrast was everything. The crunch of water chestnut against rich liver, smoke of bacon against sweet marinade. Making a full tray meant handling raw liver without flinching, which separated the hosts who were serious from the ones who just opened a bag of chips. By the 80s, organ meats fell out of favor and rumaki disappeared almost overnight, from the center of the table to something most people have never heard of. Chocolate milk made with Hershey's syrup was never just chocolate milk. It was a ratio, and everyone who grew up making it had their own and was willing to argue about it. You tilted the squeeze bottle, counted to a number, and stirred until the dark pool at the bottom lifted. Stop too soon, and you'd drink thin milk, then hit pure sweetness at the end. Hershey's syrup had been sold in tin cans since 1926, but in 1979 the company switched to the plastic squeeze bottle, the only version every 80s kid knew. The school cafeteria's chocolate milk was too uniform. The kind you made at home had variation, and you learned to correct for it pour by pour. Most kitchens don't keep a squeeze bottle anymore. The muscle memory for the count has gone quiet. Chow chow on a saltine was a snack the relish never expected to become. It was made as a condiment, cooked at harvest end when the last of the garden had to go somewhere before frost. Cabbage, onions, green tomatoes, hot peppers, sweet peppers, vinegar, mustard, celery salt, turmeric, everything processed and canned in hot jars that lined the cellar shelves. Come winter, you opened a jar and spooned a bit onto a saltine, and what you tasted was the entire garden concentrated into a single sharp, tangy, spiced bite. Chow chow is a Southern and Appalachian tradition with uncertain origins. Some historians trace it to Chinese railroad workers who brought pickled vegetable condiments west, others to French colonial preservation traditions. What is certain is that no two families made it the same, and the recipe that made your grandmother's version right died with her, because she never used a recipe at all. She made it until the garden stopped giving enough to justify the canning. Then she stopped. Here's my challenge. Make one of these this week: the cheese ball, the Chex Mix from the back of the cereal box, the popcorn balls your mother shaped with buttered hands while they were still warm. Do not look up a new version online. Make it the old way. The way your mother made it. The way it was written on that card in her handwriting that you can still picture if you close your eyes. Because these snacks did not disappear because they stopped tasting good. They disappeared because we stopped making things. We started buying everything in bags and boxes and forgot that a kitchen used to smell like something on a Saturday afternoon. Tell me in the comments which one your family made. I want to know if anyone else's mother made cereal party mix every December and stored it in a brown paper bag. I want to know if cheese balls still show up at your holiday table, or if that tradition left when your grandmother did. Because these are not just snacks. They are proof that the best things you ever ate came from a kitchen that had a recipe box, a stick of butter, and a woman who did not need a cookbook to know what her family loved. Now, I am not a doctor or a dietitian. This is not medical advice. But the women who made these snacks understood something about feeding a family that no store shelf has ever been able to replace.